Hello, and welcome. Find a comfortable chair, perhaps dim the lights a little. Tonight, we're not going to talk about ghosts or goblins, but about something far more tangible, and in many ways, far more terrifying. We're going to talk about the medieval siege. Now, when you hear that phrase, your mind probably jumps straight to the movies. You see vast armies arrayed before impossibly tall castles. You hear the thunderous roar of catapults, and you see stone walls exploding into a million pieces. You imagine heroic knights charging through a freshly made breach, swords flashing in the sun. It's a spectacle of chaos, destruction, and high drama. It's what filmmakers and game designers have lovingly crafted for us for decades, and for good reason. It's an ideal canvas for tales of heroism and valor. As people who love history, we're thrilled to see this era get so much attention. But as historians, we have to confess, we sometimes watch these scenes through our fingers, with a single, dramatic tear rolling down one cheek. Because the truth is, most medieval sieges were nothing like that. They were less of a dramatic, explosive action movie and more of a slow, grinding psychological thriller, a brutal test of logistics, engineering, and human endurance. Over time, the demands of cinematic storytelling, combined with some, let's say, enthusiastic interpretations by past historians, have built up a fortress of myths around the reality of siege warfare. Tonight, we're going to take a closer look at that fortress. We're not going to storm the walls, but we're going to patiently examine the foundations and see which parts are solid stone and which are just movie set plaster. We will tackle 5 of the most persistent misunderstandings, and as a special treat at the end, we'll delve into one of the most hotly debated aspects of castle defense. So, settle in as we begin our story. Our first myth is perhaps the most cinematic of all, the idea of crumbling walls. In popular culture, siege engines like trebuchets and catapults are depicted as medieval artillery, the equivalent of modern cannons. They hurl a few massive stones, and moments later, a huge section of a stone curtain wall dramatically collapses into a convenient ramp of rubble. The reality, however, was far less explosive and far more about a relentless, grinding application of physics. Think of a medieval stone wall not as a single, brittle object, but as a massive, layered bulwark designed specifically to absorb and dissipate energy. These weren't simple brick constructions. A high-status castle wall was often a sandwich of 2 outer faces of expertly cut, tightly fitted stone blocks, with a core filled with a dense mixture of smaller stones, rubble, and mortar. This composite structure was incredibly resilient. Where a projectile from a trebuchet, weighing maybe 300 to 400 pounds, struck the surface, the kinetic energy didn't just shatter the wall. It spread through the mass, often doing little more than knocking a single block loose or creating a pockmark on the surface. To truly break it, you had to hit the exact same spot, over and over and over again, for days or even weeks. It was less like a cannonball hitting a target and more like trying to demolish a modern concrete building with a sledgehammer. You might eventually make a dent, but it's an exhausting, inefficient process. This is why the famous siege of Stirling Castle in 1304 by Edward Hurt of England is so notable. Edward, obsessed with taking the castle, had a monstrous trebuchet built, famously named Warwolf. It took 5 master carpenters and nearly 50 workmen 3 months to assemble. When it finally fired, it did, eventually, help create a breach. But this was the exception that proves the rule. It was a massive, bespoke piece of equipment, the superweapon of its day, deployed against a single target over a prolonged period. Even then, the siege had already been going on for months. Woofs. The sieging armies simply didn't have the time, resources, or specialized engineering knowledge to replicate such a feat. The 13th century Norwegian military manual, the Konungs Skugs or King's Mirror, gives us a clue to the realistic expectations of the time. It advises a commander to have a few powerful trebuchets specifically to throw large rocks against stone walls to determine whether they are able to resist such violent blows. The phrasing here is key. It's a question, a test, not a foregone conclusion. The very fact that they had to test the walls implies that many, if not most, were expected to hold firm. The long duration of countless historical sieges where stone throwers were present, yet the walls never fell, reinforces this point. The walls were doing their job. So, if you couldn't reliably smash the main walls, what did you do? You aimed for the softer targets. This is where the real work of siege artillery was done. Attackers would target the wooden structures, built atop the walls, the battlements or merlons where archers and crossbowmen would stand. Shattering these positions wouldn't bring the wall down, but it would make it a death trap for the defenders trying to shoot back, effectively suppressing their fire. They would aim at gatehouses, which were often structurally more complex and potentially weaker than a solid stretch of wall. Most commonly, they would simply lob projectiles over the walls and into the town or bailey itself. This had a dual purpose. Firstly, it was a campaign of psychological terror. Imagine being a civilian huddled in your home, knowing that at any moment, a massive rock could come crashing through your roof. Add to this the practice of launching diseased animal carcasses or even the severed heads of captured messengers to spread fear and sickness. Secondly, it was a practical attack on infrastructure. Hitting buildings caused fires. Hitting the well could contaminate the water supply. The goal wasn't always to create a single, dramatic breach, but to make life inside the castle so unbearable, so dangerous and so miserable that the garrison would lose the will to fight. When a medieval chronicler writes that a wall was damaged by artillery, we should be cautious with our interpretation. Unless they explicitly describe a breach, they likely meant that the top of the wall walk and battlements, had been rendered unusable as a fighting platform. The fundamental structure remained intact. And what about the battering ram? The image of a massive, swinging log pulverizing a stone wall is another cinematic staple. While formidable against wooden gates or weaker walls made of brick or poorly mortared rubble, a battering ram was almost comically ineffective against a solid, well-built stone wall. The physics are simply against it. Pushing it against the wall was more of a symbolic gesture, a way of saying we are attacking you, and a practical method of destruction. Before the age of gunpowder artillery truly began in the 15th century, there was really only one reliable, albeit incredibly dangerous and laborious, way to bring down a section of a state-of-the-art stone wall: mining. This is where the real engineering battle was fought. Miners would dig a tunnel, often starting from a protected position far from the walls, and angle it down and then up to end directly beneath the foundations of the target wall or tower. This was slow, claustrophobic, and perilous work. The tunnel was shored up with heavy wooden props as they went. The defenders, meanwhile, would be listening intently, even putting out bowls of water to detect the vibrations of digging, so they could launch a countermine to intercept the attackers in a desperate underground battle. If the attackers reached their goal, they would create a chamber directly under the foundation, packed with as much dry wood, brush, and other combustible material as they could find. The original text mentions the use of eggs in the movie Ironclad. This is based on a real event from the siege of Rochester Castle in 1215. King John of England, unable to breach the keep, ordered his men to mine it. He then sent a writ demanding 40 of the fattest pigs of the sort least good for eating to bring fat to burn the fire beneath the tower. The pig fat, when ignited, would create an incredibly hot, long-lasting fire. The intense heat would burn away the wooden props, and the foundation above, now unsupported, would collapse under its own immense weight, bringing a whole section of the tower down with it. This, not a catapult, was the true medieval wall buster. It was engineering, not brute force. So, now, let's imagine our miners have been successful. The tower groans, shudders, and a great section of the curtain wall collapses into a mountain of stone and dust. The breach is made. In the movies, this is the climax. The horns sound, the hero gives a stirring speech, and the army pours through the gap to victory. This brings us to our second myth, the idea of an easy breach. A breach in the wall was a major turning point in a siege. There's no doubt about that. It was a moment of crisis for the defenders and opportunity for the attackers, but it was far from a guaranteed win. In fact, storming a well-defended breach was one of the most dangerous and costly undertakings in all of medieval warfare. For a determined garrison, the fight was just beginning. First, let's consider the physical reality of that breach. It wasn't a neat, clean doorway. It was a chaotic, unstable mountain of rubble. Massive, jagged blocks of stone, splintered timbers, and loose scree formed a steep, treacherous slope. Before any assault could even begin, this rubble often had to be cleared or at least partially levelled, a task undertaken under a hail of arrows, crossbow bolts, and rocks from the defenders who now had a perfect vantage point. The example of Richard the Lionheart at the siege of Acre in 1191 is incredibly telling. After his siege engines and miners finally brought down a section of the wall, he was faced with this very problem. To encourage his men to clear the dangerous rubble, He offered 2 gold bezants for every stone block carried away from the pile. When that proved insufficient motivation due to the sheer danger, he doubled the reward to 4 bezants. To put that in perspective, 4 gold bezants was roughly equivalent to half a month's salary for a highly skilled physician. This wasn't a casual clean-up job. It was a life-threatening task that required immense financial incentive. Even if the breach was partially cleared, the remaining base of the collapsed wall, perhaps only half a man's height, still presented a significant obstacle. An attacker, laden with armor and weapons, would have to scramble over this broken ground, all while looking up at the defenders. This brings us to the tactical problem of the breach. It was a natural bottleneck. An entire army cannot charge through a 20-foot gap simultaneously. Only a small number of soldiers could attempt to enter at any one time, forcing them into a tight, compressed formation. As they clambered up the rubble and into the gap, they were perfectly framed targets. They were exposed to crossbowmen and archers firing from the tops of the adjacent walls and towers. The attackers' own archers, positioned on the ground below, were often unable to provide effective covering fire, as they couldn't get a clear line of sight without hitting their own men. The soldiers, sent first into the breach, were known as the Forlorn Hope, and the name was tragically accurate. This was often a volunteer mission, undertaken by knights or men-at-arms desperate for glory, honor, or a significant share of the plunder if the city fell. They knew the odds were stacked against them. They could expect to face not just the rank-and-file defenders, but the garrison's hand-picked elite. The lord of the castle would place his best-armed, best-armored, and most loyal household knights in the gap, creating a solid wall of steel. Some of the most ferocious and bloody fighting of the entire medieval period took place in these narrow, contested spaces, with casualties on the attacking side being almost guaranteed to be horrific. Finally, even if you fought your way through the bottleneck, you never knew what you would find on the other side. A competent and prepared defender would have used the weeks or months of the siege to prepare for this very eventuality. Behind the threatened section of the outer wall, they may well have constructed a second, inner defense. This didn't have to be another magnificent stone wall. It could be a hastily built but effective wooden palisade, a deep ditch filled with sharpened stakes, or a series of barricades creating a maze-like killing ground. The attackers, exhausted and disorganized after fighting their way through the breach, would suddenly find themselves trapped, facing a fresh line of defense and ambushes from all sides. The breach wasn't a gateway to the city, it was often just the entrance to another, even more deadly, trap. Surrendering just because a hole appeared in your wall was often a foolish move. A well-prepared garrison could hold a breach for days, inflicting such terrible losses on the attacker that they would abandon the assault altogether. Now, we've spent a lot of time with the defenders, safe inside their stone walls. Let's turn our attention to the army outside. We have this romantic image, perhaps from tales of Robin Hood, of the besieging army living a relatively carefree life in the countryside, waiting for the enemy to starve. This leads us to our third myth, the idea that the besiegers were living the good life. The reality is that for the average soldier in a besieging army, life was a grueling, dangerous, and often short affair. It was anything but a holiday. Laying siege to a fortified position was a complex and labor-intensive operation that involved far more than just sitting around. Hard work and constant worry were the true companions of the besieger. The schedule was especially punishing at the start of a siege. A besieging army was vulnerable. The defenders inside the castle weren't just passive victims, they would frequently launch sudden, surprise attacks known as sorties. To prevent the camp from being overrun, a significant portion of the army had to be on guard duty at all times. Some sources suggest that as much as a third of the entire force could be on watch at any given moment. For an individual soldier, this could mean an 8-hour shift of pure guard duty every single day. And these were not modern 8-hour workdays. After your shift, you weren't off the clock. You were then expected to perform hard manual labor, digging ditches, raising earthen ramparts to defend the camp, constructing siege engines, and weaving mantlets, large wicker shields used for protection against arrows. On top of that, you might be sent out on patrols or armed foraging expeditions to strip the surrounding countryside of any available food. But the most feared enemy in any siege camp wasn't the knight on the wall. It was silent, invisible, and utterly ruthless. It was disease. A major epidemic could cripple an army more effectively than any battle. Siege camps were perfect incubators for sickness. You had thousands of men, and often animals, packed together in a confined space, far from home. Their bodies were not accustomed to the local food, the local water, or the local microorganisms. We must remember that in the Middle Ages, many people rarely, if ever, travelled more than a few miles from their home village. Their immune systems were highly localized. This made them incredibly vulnerable to illnesses that could flourish in camp conditions. Sanitation was rudimentary at best. Latrine pits were often dug too close to the water supply, leading to contamination. Dysentery, a violent intestinal inflammation that caused bloody diarrhea and dehydration, was rampant and known as the bloody flux. It was a notorious killer of soldiers. Typhus, spread by lice, was another common scourge. At the siege of Meaux in 1422, the victorious English army under King Henry was devastated by dysentery. The disease is estimated to have killed between 6 and 7% of the entire army. Most famously, it claimed the life of the king himself, one of the most celebrated warrior kings in English history, brought down not by a French arrow, but by a microscopic organism in a cup of contaminated water. Beyond the spectre of disease, there were other constant threats. A relief army might appear on the horizon at any moment, forcing the besiegers to fight a pitched battle on open ground, while simultaneously keeping the garrison pinned down. And then there was the ever-present problem of supply. An army, as the saying goes, marches on its stomach. A large medieval army of 10,000 men, plus thousands of horses and pack animals, consumed a staggering amount of food and fodder every single day. The idea that they could live off the land by hunting, as we see in some movies, is a complete fantasy. An army that large would hunt out every deer, boar, and rabbit in a 20-mile radius within a week. They were utterly dependent on long, fragile supply lines, convoys of wagons and barges stretching for miles back to friendly territory. These convoys were vulnerable to raids, bad weather that turned roads into impassable mud, and simple logistical breakdown. If the supplies were interrupted for even a short time, the besieging army could begin to starve faster than the besieged. In many sieges, it became a grim race to see who would run out of food first. All in all, the life of a besieger was one of hardship, toil, and constant peril. So we have this image of a vast, miserable, and disease-ridden camp. But what did it actually look like? Movies almost invariably show us neat rows of white canvas tents, a veritable city of cloth billowing in the wind. This brings us to our fourth myth, the tent city. While a commander's grand pavilion is an iconic image of medieval warfare, the reality for the common soldier was far less comfortable. Tents were, for most of the Middle Ages, a luxury item. They were expensive to produce, difficult to transport, and far beyond the means of an ordinary footman or archer. The historian Andrew Boardman, studying the Wars of the Roses in the late 15th century, a period of considerable wealth and military advancement in England, concluded that billeting outdoors without proper tents and in all weathers was accepted as a fact of everyday army life. Tents were an essential piece of gear for the wealthy elite nobles, knights and high-ranking men-at-arms who could afford them, but they were simply not available for the vast majority of the troops. Let's look at the economics. A modest pavilion tent, perhaps 11 feet in diameter, could cost around £2 sterling. For a simple foot soldier earning a few pence a day, this represented something like 160 days of pay. It was the equivalent of a modern worker spending a year's salary on a camping tent. It simply wasn't going to happen. The Chronicle of Lanercost, describing the siege of Dunbar in 1336, notes that tents were set up only for the chief men of the army. So, if they weren't sleeping in tents, where did the majority of soldiers sleep? They built their own shelter. The typical medieval siege camp was not a city of white canvas, but a sprawling shantytown of crudely built huts. These would be constructed from whatever materials were available: wood, woven branches, wattle, mud daub, turf, and straw. Some soldiers might even dig simple foxholes or lean-tos for protection from the elements. We should picture a siege camp not as a uniform, orderly military installation, but as a microcosm of the medieval social order, rendered in architecture. At the centre, you would have the large, ornate pavilions of the army's commander and his chief lieutenants, flying their banners. Arranged around them would be the smaller, but still functional, tents of the lesser knights and wealthy men-at-arms. Spreading out from this core, you would find the vast, chaotic sprawl of huts and hovels housing the thousands of common soldiers. And on the very periphery, you would likely find the makeshift shelters of the camp followers, the merchants, artisans, cooks, and women who followed the army. This collection of huts, arranged in rough rows to allow for assembly, with perhaps a clear square in the centre for mustering, would be surrounded by its own defensive ditch and palisade. It was a temporary, functional, and deeply unpleasant city, exposed to wind, rain, and cold. A week of sustained rain could turn the entire area into a quagmire of mud and filth, making life even more miserable and accelerating the spread of disease. The tent city is a convenient cinematic shorthand, but the reality was a far more primitive and desperate affair. Now, let's turn to the most spectacular piece of siege equipment of all, the one that makes for the most epic shots in any film. We are talking, of course, about siege towers. The image is unforgettable. A line of colossal wooden towers, bristling with archers, rolling inexorably towards the castle walls. But like so many other things, the reality of these behemoths was quite different, which leads us to our fifth myth. The truth is, a real siege tower was a rare, ponderous, and incredibly specialized piece of equipment. Most sieges, even major ones, never saw one. They were the superweapons of their day, only constructed when a fortress was deemed exceptionally strong and all other methods were failing. The siege tower, often called a belfry, was a monumental undertaking. They could reach heights of 80 or even 90 feet, deliberately built to overtop the section of wall they were intended to attack. This required immense quantities of timber and the skills of many master carpenters and labourers, working for weeks. Their colossal size and weight meant they were excruciatingly slow and difficult to move. The idea of them rolling across a battlefield is misleading. The ground in front of them had to be painstakingly levelled, and a path cleared of all obstacles. Even then, pushing them from behind was often impractical and exposed the crews to enemy fire. A more common and effective method of moving them was to use a system of winches and pulleys. Crews would anchor the tower to the ground with iron rings driven into the earth near the wall. Ropes would be run through these rings, and then teams of men or oxen, pulling from a safe position far to the rear, would slowly winch the tower forward, inch by painful inch. Given this glacial pace, we must understand that these were movable towers, not armoured assault vehicles. Their main purpose was not, as often depicted, to simply drive up to the wall and lower a drawbridge to dispatch a flood of soldiers. While this did occasionally happen, it was a secondary benefit, the climactic final step of their use. The primary function of a siege tower was to serve as an elevated, mobile firing platform. It was designed to give the attacker's archers and crossbowmen a height advantage. By building the tower at least 15 feet higher than the wall, they could shoot down onto the defenders on the wall walk. This oppressive fire was devastating. It could sweep the battlements clear of enemy soldiers, making it impossible for them to shoot back effectively. This provided essential cover for other operations at the base of the wall. With the defenders pinned down by fire from the tower, teams of miners could work in relative safety to undermine the wall, or infantry could bring up scaling ladders for an escalade. The tower was a force multiplier, designed to win control of a specific section of the wall through firepower. The defenders, of course, did not sit idly by while this wooden monster was being constructed and moved towards them. This often resulted in a fascinating duel of engineering. As the defenders saw the siege tower rising, they would frantically work to increase the height of their own wall in that section, often by adding wooden hoardings and scaffolding to their battlements. The goal was to maintain their height advantage. Meanwhile, their own trebuchets would be tasked with trying to smash the tower with heavy stones before it could get close, and they would prepare all manner of incendiary projectiles to try and set it on fire. To counter this, the attackers would cover their towers in fresh, wet animal hide, sheepskin, or cowhide, which were remarkably fire-resistant. The siege tower, therefore, was not a simple tool of assault, but the centerpiece of a complex tactical and engineering battle. Its presence on a battlefield signified a siege of the utmost seriousness and expense. Finally, we come to our bonus topic. An element of castle defense that is so visceral, so dramatic, that it has become utterly iconic. The image of defenders high up on the walls, pouring boiling, shimmering liquid down upon the helpless attackers below. We are talking about the controversial question of hot oil. Was it really a part of the defender's arsenal? The historian Smale famously and flatly denied it, stating it simply didn't happen. And when we look at the scene from a movie like Kingdom of Heaven, with vast cauldrons pouring out gallons of oil like a waterfall, he is absolutely correct. The use of hot oil in those quantities is pure cinematic fantasy for a number of very practical reasons. Firstly, oil was incredibly expensive. In the medieval economy, olive oil or other vegetable oils were valuable commodities used for cooking, lighting, and religious ceremonies. Pouring barrels of it off a wall would be the equivalent of a modern army using champagne in its water cannons. It was an unjustifiable waste of a precious resource. Secondly, there were immense logistical challenges. Imagine trying to heat and handle huge quantities of oil to its boiling point on a narrow, crowded wall walk, all while under attack. It would be incredibly dangerous for the defenders themselves. A single misplaced step, a tipped cauldron, and you would inflict horrific burns on your own men. Lastly, the effort would be completely out of proportion to the effect. There were far cheaper, far more readily available, and equally effective alternatives. The most obvious of these is water. Water is free, plentiful, and can be heated just as easily. While boiling water might not be as terrifying as boiling oil, it will still scald and cause serious burns. Another common projectile was hot sand. Heated in a pan, sand had the nasty ability to get inside armor joints and under helmets, causing agonizing pain and burns long after the initial impact. Quicklime, a caustic powder, could be thrown down, which would severely irritate the eyes and lungs, effectively blinding and choking attackers. And of course, there was the simplest and most effective projectile of all, rocks. They were free, everywhere, and a heavy stone dropped from a height of 60 feet could kill a man in full plate armor. Given these arguments, it's clear that oil was not used in the large-scale, dramatic way movies suggest. However, to say it never happened at all might be an overstatement. The historical record is often ambiguous, but some specialists have found evidence for the limited use of similar substances. The historian Peter Purton, an expert on medieval sieges, points to the siege of Pontoise in 1441, where the English defenders were recorded as having used boiling animal fat against the French attackers. This makes a certain amount of sense. Animal fat would be a byproduct of the garrison's food supply and therefore much cheaper than oil. Another historian, Jim Bradbury, has found some evidence to suggest that small pots of hot oil or molten fat may have been poured in very targeted ways, not as a deluge, but through murder holes in a gatehouse ceiling or through the gaps in machicolations, the stone projections that allowed defenders to drop things directly at the base of the wall. This was a specific, close-quarters defense, not a wide-area attack. So, where does that leave us? We can't label the use of boiling oil as a complete myth, but we can definitively say that the popular image is a fantasy. There was no wall of oil. There were no heroic crusaders generously splashing gallons of the stuff all over the place. The reality, if it happened at all, was a rare, desperate, and small-scale use of boiling fat or perhaps a small pot of oil, used in a very specific and targeted manner. More often than not, a defender would have reached for a bucket of hot water, a shovel of hot sand, or, most likely, just another big rock. And so, our journey through the misconceptions of the medieval siege comes to an end. We've seen that the reality was less about explosive spectacle and more about the grim, grinding realities of engineering, logistics, disease, and human endurance. The true drama of a siege wasn't just in the clash of swords, but in the quiet desperation of the starving civilian, the claustrophobic terror of the underground miner, and the logistical nightmare faced by the commander trying to keep his army from dissolving into sickness and despair. It was a contest of wills, fought with shovels and saws as much as with swords and arrows. Thank you for joining me in this look behind the curtain of history. Sleep well.